We're going to be talking about education outreach today. And during the event, just feel free to participate, ask questions, or leave comments in the YouTube chat, and we'll be able to relay them to Amalia during at any point in the talk. So I'll give just a brief introduction. I know Amalia has some slides, but so Amalie Strange is a third-year PhD candidate at the University of Phoenix in Arizona, United States. She studies honeybees, but her research has migrated a little bit more into science outreach, and her slides will cover a little bit more of that. And then we also have Shalini Iyer, who is a first-year PhD candidate at UBC in British Columbia, Canada. She's been invited to this workshop just because she has many years of experience in education outreach in lower socioeconomic environments, as well as she had played a huge transition in the transition from in-person to virtual outreach during the pandemic. So I will give it over to Amalia, and you can start your presentation.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, hi everyone. So the social event that I have for today is titled Bringing Students into the Hive, Designing and Assessing Outreach Programs. So yeah, because this is a social event, it's designed to be a bit more interactive. So in addition to a little bit of an overview about my research, I've also included some discussion questions. So hopefully we can have a great conversation about sharing our research and our work with different populations. So today, special guest introduction is what we'll do first with Shalini, and then we have a bit of an icebreaker. I'll talk through some of my research, and then we'll have a discussion with both some of the people on the Zoom call and anyone out there in the YouTube world. So Shalini, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. So hi everyone, my name is Shalini. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Prior to this, I did my bachelor's and my master's at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And in terms of, outside of research, I've been heavily involved in STEM outreach and science communication, mainly through an organization, a Canadian nonprofit organization called Let's Talk Science. So essentially, I started off by working as a site coordinator at York University, and I was essentially responsible for managing STEM outreach workshops for communities in Ontario. And I really worked to reach out to more or less affluent and marginalized communities to make science and STEM outreach more accessible and tailored towards diverse groups. And then afterwards, I worked as a program assistant where I worked with Black youth in Toronto. And essentially, our goal was to, again, make science and STEM outreach more accessible to these communities, for example, like bringing in Black scientists or doing career workshops with POCs. So I worked in person and in virtual, and then essentially my major kind of involvement in digital outreach began where at the peak of the pandemic, where I worked as a summer program assistant. So we spent the entire summer converting all of the in-person outreach to be conducted digitally, also taking marginalized and less affluent communities into account, like Indigenous populations, low income and rural populations into consideration. So that's kind of the gist of my outreach experience.
Yeah, thanks, Shalini. It's great to hear all the work you've been doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so some questions to get us started off for today. So what brings you all to the session today? Have you been involved in outreach before? And what do you hope to gain from this session? Are you, looking to design a program for yourself? Are you looking to join a program? What do you hope to learn about outreach? So Shalini, you've obviously been involved in outreach before. What are you hoping to gain out of this session?
So essentially like the session online, sorry, it was my Wi-Fi, so you were breaking. So if you could repeat the question.
Yeah. I was just wondering, what do you hope to gain from this session today? I'm really looking forward to a discussion with you and sharing experience.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to kind of, sharing my experiences, but also kind of hearing what questions sort of people have, because that really helps me sort of identify like gaps in STEM outreach, and really kind of bring out the maybe some sort of issues that we have. And then I could like potentially through my experiences help sort of like fill in those gaps or resolve and kind of work towards like my mission of kind of making education more accessible. And I think it will also be great to hear about other people's experiences if they are willing to share, because I think you can learn a lot from other people.
Yeah, exactly. I think, personal experience is so important when we're talking about, making things accessible, because how are you supposed to know if, you don't have a different perspective? And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's really something that's guided my research is my experience as a first generation student, as someone who comes from a low socioeconomic status background, someone who's part of the LGBTQ community. So all of these
Mm-hmm.
different, aspects of our lives really inform the way that we are working with different communities. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing if there's anyone in the chat. Amanda, is there anyone in the YouTube chat?
So we don't have any comments from it or about it in the YouTube chat yet. So yeah, just to be clear, any questions that Amalia asks are also open to viewers as well. If you want to put your own comments in, I know the YouTube chat is limited, I think, to 200 characters. So if you need to make a few threads, you're welcome to add your input.
Yeah.
But I guess I can move into sort of like or me and Valentine can kind of give our feedback on sort of what we hope to
Yeah.
gain from this. I think I'm really interested just because you've talked about this sort of virtual beehive tour. For me, I'm really interested in not only talking with other people who did education outreach, but I think just yeah, seeing and hearing you talk about how you designed this cool virtual bee tour. I hope that's part of your your program.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, we'll get there.
Cool.
Yep. Maybe I can just provide a follow-up about my short experience in science outreach as a researcher mainly. Um, so as for me, it has been more about really outreach rather than education. I think that maybe slightly different in the sense that as a researcher, you might be invited by like museums or special events. So in the UK and Europe, we have the Pint of Science. I don't know if that cross the big ocean to the US or to Canada. And so one of the limits, I guess, of such events is as a researcher, you don't control the crowd that, that visits, for instance, the museum or visits the events you are talking in. But while you are not controlling the crowd, you also now know that the people coming to cultural or science events are usually not from the low socioeconomic status. So as a researcher, then you have to be very proactive if you want to really reach out the comfort zone of just inhabiting museums and places of scientific power in a way. And so I know there are many associations or organizations, for instance, if you want to do outreach in jails or to children, um, but that 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 involves researchers to be very proactive. So maybe this could be one of the items of the discussion. What's the role of the researcher in the community, and how can we afford as well for in our career to dedicate time for this quite instrumental um, role as a researcher? Does it resonate with what you had in mind for your discussion?
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's I really appreciate what you said about the role of the researcher in a community, because um that is something that I think a lot about when I'm going out into communities, and I'll touch on it a bit too. So I'm really happy that you brought that up. yeah, so I guess we'll head into the presentation bit. So my name's Amalia. I'm a third-year PhD candidate in Guru Amdam's lab at Arizona State University. I also got my BS in genetics and a BA in Spanish literature at ASU. And while I was an undergraduate, I was doing work with honeybees. I was doing undergraduate research with the same mentor, Guru Amdam. And it was just such a positive mentorship experience that I ended up sticking around. And she was gracious enough to let me do a PhD in her lab. So it's been a fantastic mentorship relationship that I've had. And she encourages me to really follow, projects that are exciting for me. And so what I'm working on now is I am researching digital environmental education with children in these low SES communities. So when I first started thinking about like, how do we teach children about nature? How do we reach out to these communities and think about how different people are connecting with nature? I realized that the definition of nature can be kind of a challenging thing to define because we always have these views of nature, I think, of these pristine, untouched landscapes where, we picture national forests and things like that. But I would argue, and there's a large body of scholarship behind it, that nature includes humans, and so it's present in our daily lives. It can be these kind of large scale, majestic mountains that we see, or it can be something that's smaller and it's at the neighborhood scale. So, it could even be weeds that pop up from the sidewalk. And I think it's important to question our definition of nature, especially when we're working with different communities, because different people will have different experiences based on their environment. And I also wanted to think about what is connection to nature. And the definition that I've landed on is that it's this sense that humans are part of nature, that we're part of the ecology, that you don't really have to go somewhere to experience nature because it can be found in all sorts of different places. However, this connection to nature requires a connection or an access to nature. So when we're thinking about like the material access that people have to nature, there's a lot of inequity in that. And there have been studies in Phoenix specifically that I focus on about redlining. So that was a discriminatory practice of not allowing groups, particularly Black Americans, to purchase homes in these areas. And it has had all of these different ecological side effects, all of these ecological effects. So things like higher surface temperatures in these redlined areas, things like decreased biodiversity when compared to wealthier neighborhoods. There's also inequitable tree distribution in Phoenix, Arizona. So tracking with those incomes in different neighborhoods. And also this idea that just because you have access to a green space doesn't mean you're exposed to it. So just because this was a study done in Canada, but just because you are, say, within a 10-minute walk from a park, doesn't mean that that is something that you're having daily interactions with. So all of these ideas were influencing me in how I think about how children connect with nature, especially when their landscapes look different compared to other groups. There's also this sort of attitudinal component to accessing nature, because just because you have the material access to it, there's a lot of different factors that can affect your ability to interface with the nature. So, for example, there's a study done by Kelly Larson here at Arizona State University, looking at how different socioeconomic status groups and their perceived fear of honeybee attacks. So they found that people in lower SES groups tended to score higher on this scale of fear of honeybees because of reduced financial resources to deal with such interactions with honeybees. So it's just one of these ways that class kind of maps on to our interactions with animals. So my research questions that I focus on, I wanted to think about providing access to nature experiences and doing this in a digital setting because it can be more accessible. So I wanted to look at what types of ontological or like shifts in reality take place when an experience of nature is digital. So how does the reality of nature change for children when they're experiencing it through, say, a Zoom beehive tour? I also wanted to think about how these digital experiences of nature affect children's environmental ethic and daily interactions with nature. So after they go through this type of digital experience, how are they interacting with, say, their playground? Or, how are they conceptualizing these ethical dilemmas that they have or that they might be engaging with? And then specifically, how do children in these low SES neighborhoods, where there are documented differences in their natural landscape, how do these children in low SES neighborhoods interact with their natural surroundings? So to study this, I created a digital interactive beehive tour and a packet called Healthy Habits of Honeybees and Humans for elementary school. So this type of outreach is done in 2 45-minute sessions. So first we talk about healthy habits of honeybees and humans, and the goal here was to kind of start unsettling some of those really strict human-animal boundaries, and start to think about how we could build empathy with other species. So that's why I have designed the packet so that children are comparing some of their eating habits and some of their hygienic behaviors to the behaviors of honeybees. And children are able to see that they do things that are kind of similar to honeybees. They also comb their hair, they wash their face. They have to make sure that they're eating a balanced diet. So it's a way of, seeing the similarities in another animal while also respecting that there are certain differences. And then the next part is a digital interactive beehive tour. So that is also on Zoom. And it's where I essentially take the students through a tour of a beehive. So we have these observation hives that are encased in like a thin, transparent acrylic. And I'm able to show students the where the brood are, where the honeybees are storing their honey. I'm able to point out different jobs that bees are performing, like nursing behavior, the queen. They always really are excited to see the queen bee and see the little nurse bees that are around her. And they're able to see the foragers coming in with pollen baskets full of pollen. And it's really awesome that this is a Zoom experience and not just a pre-recorded experience, because students are actually able to interact with me live. So if they have any questions about something, they have some agency in saying, oh, can we go back to this part actually? Can we talk more about this topic that I'm interested in? And it's a way of getting them excited about bees because, even though bees are charismatic, so half the work is already done there, it's still good that children are able to express what they like about bees and what they're interested in and get to explore that some more.
Sorry,
So
Amalie. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
So up until just then, it was still on the slide talking about nature and communication. Did you have?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, was it supposed to be switching during?
Yes, it was. Oh, huh. That's
yeah.
odd.
So
okay.
Right now we see research questions.
Okay, and now it's the digital interactive tour.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we see. It's like on like a little computer screen.
Yes, that's it.
Okay. That's what we're looking at.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know that. Oh gosh. Okay. Yes. So that was the thinking behind this tour. And so then when I was designing this, I was also thinking with some ethical and pedagogical frameworks. So I chose this transformative value ethical framework, because this philosopher, Brian Norton, was talking about how an experience with nature can be said to have transformative value if it changes the way that people are consuming natural resources. So the example that I've got here is, say you've got a child who really likes to pick flowers. And maybe after learning about bees, after learning about how bees interact with flowers and their relationship with that part of their landscape, maybe children decide to not pick flowers. Maybe they decide to plant a garden or do something like that. So their consumption patterns have changed. A pedagogical framework that I've been working with is from this book called Critical Teaching in Everyday Life. And specifically this idea of extraordinarily re-experiencing the ordinary. So this is kind of the idea that, there are things that you can see in your daily life, but, having a really transformative experience, it links back to the transformative value. Having a transformative experience of you're able to analyze something in a different way. You're able to see it with different eyes. So for example, children might have seen one bee when they're walking around, but it can be really extraordinary for them to see all of the bees and see how the entire society of a beehive works. And I also think that the digital format provides a different way of looking at our relationship with bees. And I go into this a little bit too with some of the trade-offs of doing this type of tour in a digital format. So there's some limitations, like there's a reduced multisensory engagement. So, you're not actually in person with the bees, you're not smelling them, you don't feel the wind from their wings. But this does result in this digital part. It has increased accessibility, especially after, so many places have improved infrastructure for this type of digital education in their classrooms because of the pandemic. So it's, more accessible for, say, low-income families who, at least here, field trips do often have a small fee that students have to pay. But it's not just this fee. Oftentimes, you also have to think about how are students getting lunch. For students on the free and reduced meal plans who get lunch at school, thinking about how do these families, when there's a field trip, how are they, that's another cost that they're incurring. So it's more accessible for that. It's also more accessible for people who have different disabilities. So for example, wheelchair users or things like other types of aids that people use. Because it's a digital experience, it can be easier than trying to navigate a lot of the inaccessible terrain around beehives. Another of the limitations from my tour is that I am only focusing on honeybees. So as much as I'd like to focus on all different types of bees and show like a really diverse view of bees, it is only focused on honeybees for now. And it's also just a drop-in model. So this type of model is when someone like a researcher or a different type of expert comes into a school and they aren't sticking around for very long. They are maybe staying there for 1 or 2 visits and then, leaving, and there's not that prolonged relationship. So part of this has to do with just the limitations that I have as a PhD student. So it can be kind of challenging to create a semester-long inquiry project and then also have time to analyze that data. So that is a limitation of this, is that I am kind of limited to these 2 sessions that I have with students. But I think that's outweighed by some of the safety benefits that students are getting. So instead of interacting directly with bees, it is a bit safer for students to see bees on a digital format. You're not, risking students having a really adverse time with bees because, say, they get stung or something like that. That can really just shut down their ability to connect with bees. And then this type of beehive also is better at maintaining the group dynamics compared to something like a virtual reality tour. So I know that virtual reality education is also really popular these days. But at least for my purposes here, I really wanted to be able to maintain some of those classroom dynamics where children are able to still talk amongst themselves and interface with each other directly like that. So then the ways I'll be assessing this program, I have 2 different qualitative methods that I'll be using. I'll be doing an arts-based activity. So talking with students about how should humans live with bees, and then going along with that, building empathy for another species, talking about how might bees want to live with humans. and trying to think of something from a different species point of view. And then also, what responsibilities do humans have to bees, and trying to make sure that the discussion that we have, that this arts-based activity that we have, it's not with the goal of finding a correct answer, but there could be a bunch of different answers depending on students' interactions and knowledge about honeybees. And then the second way I'll be assessing this program is through a walking interview or go-along interview, looking at how children are interacting with their everyday natural surroundings, and then how children are expressing their ethical considerations in these interactions. So that'll be really exciting. I'll be taking small groups of children throughout a natural space that they are in daily. So like their schoolyard or something like that, a playground. And then these are some other, I just wanted to touch briefly on some other assessments that people could use for if they're designing their own outreach program or working with a pre-made outreach program. So there are several quantitative assessments that you can use. So pre and post tests are really popular, where you are measuring how much knowledge students had about a given subject area beforehand, and then comparing that to their scores on these tests afterwards. And then there's also several attitude surveys that you can use to assess your outreach program. So, for example, attitudes towards science, if students feel like they are belonging to the science community. It can be attitudes towards a topic. So, for example, the type of subject that you're working with. Mine would be bees, or if you're working with a different model organism. Or you could also do something like connectedness to nature. And that's actually the scale that I have over here. It shows different ways that people conceptualize how connected they are to nature. So someone with a really high connectedness to nature or inclusion of nature in self score would pick something like this, where you're totally merged with nature. You really see yourself as part of nature. Someone with a lower score would see themselves as completely separate with nature. And then there's also a bunch of qualitative assessments that you can do. So for example, this draw a scientist prompt has always been a classic one for outreach, assessing outreach, seeing what stereotypes children have about scientists and how that changes after they've gone through an outreach program. And you can also do open-ended surveys. So these are just open-ended questions that you would then qualitatively analyze and see what people think about them. So that's my research. And now we can get into some of the discussion questions. So I want everyone to think about a meaningful educational experience that you've had. This could be education like in the school. This could be education outside of school. This could be an outreach experience, some experience where you've learned something, and what made that experience meaningful.
Again, I guess we'll reach it out to the YouTube chat, but just in case some people are still typing, I think when you're asking about like a meaningful educational experience, do you mean like something when we were being taught, or like when sort of we were the ones teaching? Because I get like, for me, through science outreach, I feel like you get really meaningful experiences when kind of you're the one doing the outreach and teaching them all these cool things, like to see like how excited they get over something, or to see how interested and fascinated, or when they like, oh, it's like I didn't think about that before. I think that's always super meaningful, like when you can see that they're actually learning and actually as excited about it as you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great experience. And especially when they like develop all these questions about something, that always makes me really excited that they're thinking about honeybees in a way that's different than they were before.
Yeah, and we do actually have someone like Tana who had mentioned anything that's out of the school routine is always fun. So yeah, I guess when you get to go outside and get to do fun things that you wouldn't normally do in your everyday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she said that those are
for sure.
always really nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Shalini, have you had some meaningful educational experiences, either as the one teaching or the one experiencing?
Yeah, I think I've had meaningful experiences from like both ends. So I guess I'll start with, when I was being taught. So I think a few of my science teachers in high school, whenever the concept was taught hands-on, I felt like I learned a lot better. So I remember like when first learning about DNA, we were given licorice and the little candy, putting the nucleotides together, but something so basic, but 10 years later, I still remember learning it that way. It just means it has a really big impact on your learning experience. And there was like multiple things, like in my physics class, I think every 2 weeks, my teacher would have a hands-on lab. So just instead of applying all those equations, you would actually like use objects to kind of, like, if it was kind of like one of those, I don't know, I remember putting a ball on a stick and like rotating it and calculating like I forgot what it was, but the rotation, like torque or whatever, the movement. So like things like that, I think was really meaningful during high school. And I think it shaped my scientific like journey as well. And then in terms of like teaching, it was very similar to the kind of the last activity you had posted, like drawing a scientist. I think it was it was a long-term change we saw in the students. It was with the youth that Amanda and I worked with in Toronto, the Black community we work with, and essentially in the kind of beginning of the year, we would always tell them to like draw a scientist, or what do you think a scientist looks like? And I would either be like Einstein or a typical like Caucasian man. And then over time we would, do these activities and try to, really get away from that stereotype. And then what would be really great, and we would repeat it at the end of the year, and they would often like draw themselves, which was great, or they would draw one of the volunteers, like the Let's Talk Science volunteers, or like even just someone they know, like their mom might be like a nurse, or their sibling or someone they know. Some of them might even draw their teacher. And so they were kind of learning that scientist is more of a universal like kind of word, which was, I think, really, really great to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it kind of gets back to what Valentine was saying at the beginning about the role of a researcher in a community, that, students can see themselves represented as doing this type of job.
We
Yeah,
also have another a bit more input from the YouTube chat. Again, like Tana mentioned, that it's also a lot easier to remember or learn something when you have to search answers by yourself instead of being given the answers for free. So it's true, instead of, they actually get to go out and search for the answer themselves instead of just reading it in a book or something.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most valuable experiences I've had have come after kind of struggling with ideas. And they're ones that I remember the most, like especially in math class or chemistry, really trying to understand concepts. And then you have that magic moment where you're like, oh, I understand how everything fits together now. I think those are really impactful for students.
Yeah.
100%. I think it also like helps when you're put in groups and you're like working together to solve the puzzle. Because I remember in high school, I don't know if everyone knows, but there's like trends in the periodic table, like radiuses and things like that. And I remember our science teacher put us in groups, gave us the periodic table, told us like the definition of the concept, and was like, you know what a periodic table is? Now figure out the trends. So like it actually worked. We would spend the entire period. So like things like that, like, making students dig for it and like work for it, but not like when you do it independently, it could feel very lonely. So working in a group and you're able to learn from others would also make the educational experience very meaningful.
Yeah, and I think that's really meaningful for students who want to pursue science careers as well, because I think it's so important to kind of break that stereotype of science as an individual pursuit. And really show students that it is such a collaborative mission, that, you're constantly working with other people. So it's great that, we can do activities that show students how to work together in addition to just learning the course content.
For sure.
Katerina also mentioned in the chat that they said, I've always liked practical things, for example, assessing animal welfare in a zoo. So that is kind of cool, instead of just yeah, you can actually, well, I think a zoo is sort of that like big example where like everyone would love to work in a zoo. I think that'd be so fun. But I do remember doing some animal behavior trips to zoos, and it really hit home. You learn a lot more when you're sort of immersed in it.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's interesting that you bring that up too, because I started my PhD during the online education year, during that first year of the pandemic, and I was taking all my introductory animal behavior classes online. And the professor set up all of these different experiments that we could do. He set them up live, and so we did them where he was like, for example, broadcasting some different ants' nests. And so we would document how they were foraging and different things like that. Or we used these like live stream webcams to look at people's what was it, like step length and how fast they were walking. So it's so awesome when you can do those practical things and that there are digital options as well.
Mhm. And Shalini, one question I had for you in terms of like seeing a meaningful educational experiences, we, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the last places we went to, like when we actually did the in-person Let's Talk Science, it was your middle school, right?
Oh, yes, it was my middle school. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was it like when you were in middle school? Was there any science outreach that came to you? And like, it's just so funny to see, like, did you have those kind of resources when you went there?
I think times have changed. I don't really recall we ever, like, I think we had scientists in the class and they would come from the Ontario Science Center, but that's something the school has to pay for, so it wasn't often. So it would be very occasional. So I think like, Let's Talk Science or nonprofit organizations that do outreach just make it more accessible, and you can have visits. Like we did visits a couple classrooms in a span of like a week. So something like that. But going back and just seeing it and being able to give back to the community I grew up in, it was a great feeling.
And exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I go and talk to my old high school sometimes, and it's awesome just knowing that these teachers are doing so much with the resources that they have. So it's great to be able to go back and offer them a different experience for their classes.
Yeah, and it goes back to
100%.
what Laitana said in the chat, anything out of the normal school routine. So even though the teachers probably say it however many times a day, having people that's not your teacher come in and say the exact same thing, they're probably like, oh, this is so much cooler.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have another question. Do we want to move on to that one?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So thinking back on accessibility, how can we make outreach programs accessible for diverse groups? And I just want to acknowledge here that we do all have our own like situated knowledges that are informed by our different identities. So just thinking about populations that you might have worked with before, groups that you're interested in working with, groups that are important to you that have some sort of you have some sort of personal connection with. How can we make outreach programs accessible for these groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it really it comes up to the perspective of you yourself have to really keep an open mind. You have to go in with like, I know nothing almost, and you have to like learn from others. So every like group or population that you work with is going to be different. There's like, there's a whole range of POCs. There's the LGBTQ community. There are people with learning disabilities. So when you're the educator, you have to kind of learn from the audience. You have to see where they're at, where their strengths and weaknesses are, how they're learning best, and really tailor the educational experience towards that. So no lesson can be then reused for like a different group. I feel like it just really needs to be like individualized or tailored towards that group that you're working with, based on kind of like my experience. Like, for example, when me and Amanda worked with the Black youth, we would essentially like, they learn through hands-on. We can't like have like lecture a concept in the beginning. Their minds would just, their attention span would not be there. So we would always kind of like do the hands-on activity and then pop in little discussion questions like throughout and try to, engage them that way to make sure they're learning. So kind of like really assessing the group.
Yeah, it's this, huh?
I was just gonna say we always had different intros for the younger kids and the older kids because the younger ones just would
age. Yeah, the age always plays a role too.
Yeah, that's what I've seen too working. I work primarily with elementary school students, and yeah, I think age definitely, it's interesting to see because I think too, with the younger children that I've worked with, they're so imaginative too. They are, when we've done the worksheet, they're really able to put themselves in the place of bees, and they're really able to imagine, like, oh, if I was living here, this is what I would do. And how children kind of like put themselves in certain like role-playing scenarios. Yeah, it's been really interesting to see how children interact like that. But also I was going to say, Shalini, you made me think of this kind of pedagogical approach of like co-learning, and when teachers kind of situate themselves as co-learners with the students, and kind of like really assessing that power dynamic that is often implicit with teacher and student, and trying to do what you can to level it out a bit, and make students feel like that there's not such a stark contrast between the teacher who has historically been presented as like someone who knows everything and has just this unquestioned bank of knowledge, and seeing it as someone who is also still on their learning journey. And that's what I try to present myself as when I do these tours, is that, even though I know a lot about bees, I'm still constantly learning. Because, especially when you're working with something as complex as a social insect.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the kids are so curious that they would often ask like the most amazing questions, and sometimes I wouldn't know them. So I'm like, Amanda and I used to do this often. We actually don't know, and then we would search up the question, and then we would let the students know. And like that really shows that we don't know everything. We're just at the same level as you are, and we're also learning.
Yeah. We got, what's the rarest bird? What's the rarest flower? What's the rarest? Like they would always want to know about the rarest or the biggest or something like that. So they were always asking those cute questions.
That's cool. And it makes that like educational learning process, or like the research process, really, it makes that accessible to groups because they see that, there's not a given way to be a scientist or to know everything. So they kind of get that behind the scenes look at, this is how we look things up. This is how we do research. This is how we, assess claims on the internet about the rarest bird, for example. So I think that's really awesome. That's really cool.
And Valentes, I kind of took over the last question host-wise. Did you want any input on this one?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Oh, I think there is something I wanted to mention. I think Shalini, you mentioned learning disabilities as well. And I think that's something where we can also like really take this into account in our working with groups, working with individuals and assessing what kind of accommodations they might need too. So especially when we're working on, say, like a digital platform, looking at, things like live transcription, things like having slides available, having different ways for children to interact with materials. And I think that, having hands-on materials is such a great way to do that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, working with students with disabilities, it's like, I feel like, or even any students, I think you always have to give some positive reinforcement and never make them feel like, they may already feel like they're behind compared to their peers. So you think always being, looking at how much they've grown and really highlighting that during their educational experience is important.
And actually, I think that leads perfectly into one of the other questions I have. So I'm just going to skip ahead to that one. And that's, how can we make science outreach welcoming for diverse groups? So thinking about not just making it accessible, but how can we make
Mm-hmm.
it an environment where students can really thrive and feel like they have this sense of belonging there.
I think
Yeah.
something that we were kind of just talking about is, yeah, make it, welcoming in terms of the fact that, like, if someone doesn't know something and you don't know something, say, well, let's find it together. Let's Google, or let's figure it out. Or that's a good question. I'll let you know next time. So I think just always having that positive outlook, and letting them know there are no stupid questions, because we don't know everything either.
Yeah, and especially like
100%.
looking at like schools that have been underfunded, it could be that even though there is mandatory curriculum or like curriculum guidelines, some students just some schools don't always meet those guidelines. Some students have different personal life obstacles that they have gone through that have made it challenging for them to achieve these things. So yeah, I think always just kind of um, this might sound kind of controversial, but I think sometimes the metric isn't always the most important thing, or like those benchmarks aren't always um, the thing that facilitates learning. I think it can be a really individual journey, and benchmarks are great for assessing like progress, but I think there's other ways that we can do it too, and that's kind of why I went with the qualitative methodologies for assessing my outreach program, because I think sometimes when you do things quantitatively, it can be difficult to get the whole picture.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think in a situation like this is where equity comes into play, like where you mentioned those benchmarks. I just, when you have these disadvantages like socioeconomic status, or, you face discrimination, or you have certain family situations that can really prevent you from reaching those benchmarks that are set in place. So really, it comes down to equity and how we can provide, more resources so that, we can help those disadvantaged populations reach those benchmarks, but also make the environment, welcoming, so that they're able to kind of step into it and access those resources. Because, it, like the science community itself, I feel like it could feel so intimidating when you're against someone else who does not have those disadvantages, and it could seem like they're miles ahead of you, and then that prevents you from progressing. So I just, I feel like there needs to be resources in place essentially to kind of, mitigate that.
Yeah, and resources that don't necessarily relate directly to the content material, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of this one study that just provided snacks at an
Mm-hmm.
outreach event and saw that student scores improved so much. So it's always about like thinking with your groups that you're working with, and thinking about like not just their educational needs, but different needs outside of just what you're teaching them.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. Like the program that um, Amanda and I worked for, the students received like a whole meal after school, and then we proceeded to start our activity. And just small changes like that can really help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's awesome.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And just like having representative people. I think maybe people who had similar experiences. I think it's really changing now. So there's a lot of like people from different communities coming to speak, or like facilitating the outreach experience themselves. So when a kid goes, "Oh, this person looks like me," it really like warms your heart, and it makes the experience more. They are able to approach that person more and ask questions and engage.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like it reduces that barrier to participate when you just, when you know that someone else has, at least on the surface, a similar
Mm-hmm.
experience as you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Has anyone had any experiences where, like you had those breakthrough moments with a student, or you had situations where you just felt really welcomed in a science outreach space?
Hmm.
I know, flipping it on you a little bit.
Yeah, did I have? Oh, I'm trying to think that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this one experience that I had in high school. One of the local community colleges actually did like a STEM camp 2 weeks over the summer. And it was like, the people participating in the program, it was primarily men. So there were, maybe 2 tables out of 6 of us girls in the class, but we got to talk and have some really fantastic conversations with one of the professors who was managing the program. And she told us so much about like what it's like to be a scientist, what it's like to be a woman in STEM. And I just think that was such a meaningful conversation. It's something that, after that conversation, I feel like I was able to talk to her and really ask more about, what's it like to be a scientist? And it was one of those things that made me feel like, okay, yeah, this is a career that I want to pursue now. Yeah, that just those small conversations can have such difference.
100%. Yeah, I don't know if I've had a major breakthrough moment yet, so maybe I'm still waiting for mine.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I guess it's always just kind of fun when, when you work with the same kids over and over again, and, they get to know you, and, when you miss one session, oh, where were you? And it's kind of like when they start to get to know you. I think that's always the cutest for me is like, when the kids are excited for the event, but then, they always ask you the questions, and they, just like you said, start to become comfortable talking to you. So I think that's probably it.
Yeah, it's that relationship building.
Yeah.
Yeah, that relationship building is so important with outreach and everything. And yeah, building connections with the places that you're going and talking to. Yeah, and then I did want to talk about one final question. I know we've got 10 minutes left roughly.
Yep.
Yeah, so with all these considerations, how making science outreach accessible, making it welcoming, how might these be different when we're thinking about an in-person versus a digital program? What are some things that you think of or that you've implemented yourself in kind of executing these types of programs?
When
oh yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
I was just going to say, kind of when I'm thinking about what we did for Let's Talk Science, like I wasn't part of the transition. I kind of came into Let's Talk Science when Shalini had already done all the virtual migration. But I guess sometimes when you do those in-person events, you can kind of show them and you only need really one set of tools. But I guess when it's virtual, like each week, one of us would actually deliver little individual kits for each of the kids. Shalini, yeah, you usually did like the buying and the kit making and everything. So I guess that's one extra step you have to consider is you're not there if you forget a popsicle stick or something like that. So it's that planning ahead of time to give each kid a little kit that they can actually play with or do the experiment with you.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely that is one obstacle with in-person and digital. I think when I was converting the kind of like the in-person to digital, we created a mix of workshops. So initially we started off like this was at the peak of the pandemic, and like we couldn't even go to the stores to buy anything, and also prepping packages for like hundreds of students across Canada is a near impossible task sometimes. I mean, it literally was. So then what we did is we started off by creating workshops, potentially using materials that are accessible within your home, but also at the same time providing like alternative materials that they can use. So for example, like I'm just trying to think of like if an experiment that I potentially designed. Yeah, it's been a while, but for example, I think we did like a density experiment, and usually, where you layer the different liquids and they stack up on top of each other, so you could provide alternatives for one of them. Like honey, it just needs to be thick enough, like maple syrup or something else that's like very thick enough. And then obviously, if they don't have it, you would demo it. Or for example, if we would do a lot of construction-based projects, so that way, like, if they don't maybe have paper or or if they don't have cardboard, they can use paper, or they can use sort of like whatever materials to essentially put together and essentially create that structure and like test it out. So just really like it was taking into consideration that not everyone has, you know, money or time to essentially, you know, go out and buy certain materials, especially when you're doing digital workshops. Or we try to create like little things that are just projected digitally, like an escape assign. I think someone had designed like a little STEM escape room, so the students essentially need no materials. So it's just like you do the activity online, but you're engaged. So I guess it really depends on the population you're working with. And then, for example, like when we work with like I work with the Indigenous population, and in that case, we were collaborating with like another organization, and they essentially provided iPads for every student, so you can make the digital like program accessible to them. And then Let's Talk Science prep the materials for all the activities and then gave it to them. So it depends whether the population has access to those like resources. And if not, then you again have to deliver.
Yeah. Well, and that's something. Sorry, I see your hands on time really quick, but that's something that I think of with my digital program is, you know, I can't assume that, you know, just because we are kind of outfitted for this infrastructure now, this type of digital learning, you know, I do have to think about, you know, that might not always be the case, and what resources can I provide to my classrooms that I'm working with, like in terms of mobile hotspots or a Chromebook that they might be able to use for this type of thing. So thinking through that and applying for funding to make that possible. Valentine.
Well, I think you were just covering what I wanted to ask you about that. So there are some trade-offs between in-person events, which can be a barrier because it requires people to want to go there. So it's an effort to move to go there, and so they need to be interested. It might be costly to move, like in a city. It depends on public transport. It depends on whether you have a car or you don't. But on the other hand, digital programs, they are indeed now finally fairly cheap. Well, at least having a smartphone, maybe using, but still, it is not that cheap for many people. So if you want a stable internet connection, but in addition to the cost, there is also the knowledge. So turning up a phone connected to internet, like even for our conference today, there's a lot of work involved in trying to communicate how everything works with the live stream, the Discord, how everything interacts. And we are talking to academic people. So it seems that there are these trade-offs which are not easy to address. So I just wanted your reflection, but I think you already started to cover that.
Yeah. And I think that's where we get into like a lot of the systemic barriers to education and to knowledge is, you know, just having the time to sit down and try to figure something out, figure out how to navigate, you know, maybe getting a mobile hotspot, getting something to work. And a lot of those burdens fall, especially with what I work with, a lot of those burdens fall on people in low SES communities. So yeah, it's always just thinking through that and trying to come up with, you know, ways that you know, we can provide for the groups that we're working with.
Yeah, I think ultimately, like it's so difficult to find that balance because, like, in person, it's such a huge barrier for certain populations. And then with digital, it's sometimes a question: is it engaging enough? Are they still learning effectively? So there's always like those concerns, like that in-person like interaction you have. No matter, I feel like how hard you try, sometimes it's so difficult. You're not getting that hands-on experience. So I think there's like just definitely pros and cons to each.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt the good discussion, but we have about a minute left. So are there any final messages or comments?
Yeah, any questions on the live stream?
I think we're good.
Can I maybe just
Oh, yeah.
quizzing in the meantime while the chat is maybe writing the final questions, just to conclude the discussion about the digital tools. So there's also the question of which tools are we using? So if by providing a digital program, you are also hoping to develop empowering through digital awareness, like to learn, to teach how people can use digital tools. Are you also thinking about the tools you choose so that these are not, these are empowering tools? So like, for instance, you would try to maybe to use free software, like the open source, I mean, rather than big corporation software that then you're locked into for years after you learn because it's the only thing you've been facing during your education? Or is it something you integrate into design of your digital program? Or maybe you also need to be pragmatic and go with what works and what you have access to in your university? Or
Yeah, that's such a great point. Because I think too, you know, talking about us as we think about the needs of the people that we're working with, but I think too it's also important to recognize that, you know, even us as the people doing the outreach can also be from these types of disadvantaged backgrounds, and we might also need accommodations and need to work around the challenges that we have. So yeah, that's a fantastic comment.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to you both, Amelia and Shalini. I loved revisiting the old days of my education outreach. So there is actually a Discord channel specifically for discussions on the education outreach workshop. Amalia, if you don't have access to that yet, we'll make sure you have access to it so you can answer any questions. So again, thank you to you both, and thank you to everyone who attended and watched. We now have another break, and just in 30 short minutes at 9 p.m. GMT, we're starting our third session of the day, where we'll start with a plenary talk by Elizabeth Tibets. So hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you very much.